Terrorism. Let's be honest, it's a word we hear all the time. It's on the news, it drives political debates, and it creates a lot of fear. But what does it actually mean? Where did this idea even come from? And what could possibly drive people to commit such terrible acts of violence? Okay, let's get into it. We're going to break down this incredibly complex and charged topic, looking at the causes and expressions of terrorism, all based on our source material. So, where do you even start? Well, a dictionary definition is usually a pretty good launchpad. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it like this: the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Seems pretty straightforward, right? You've got unlawful, you've got violence, and political aims. That gives us a solid baseline to work from. But as you're about to see, the real world is, well, it's a lot messier than that. And here's where things take a really wild turn, right at the origin of the word terrorism itself. This quote, it's from Maximilien Robespierre, one of the main guys from the French Revolution. During that whole period they called the Reign of Terror, he and his followers actually called themselves terrorists, and they were proud of it. They saw their actions, which was state-sponsored violence, not as something evil, but as a kind of pure, fast-acting justice, a virtue even that was necessary to protect their revolution. So get this. The word didn't start as a label for rebels, but as a badge of honor worn by the state. So, to figure out how we got from Robespierre's idea of virtue all the way to what we think of today, here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start by nailing down the modern term, then jump into that classic debate, terrorist or freedom fighter. From there, we'll look at the huge range of ideologies involved, the tools they use, and finally, we're going to dig deep and search for the psychological why. All right. First up, what are we really talking about when we say terrorism in today's world? Because as the source material points out, it's an incredibly loaded term. A lot of the time, it's used more as a political insult than a precise analytical word. So here's the absolute key distinction in how we use the word today. For the most part, the label terrorism is saved for violence carried out by non-state groups. Think about it. When a government uses force, it's often called law enforcement or military action. It's seen as legitimate or benign. But when a group without a state does it, it's almost always framed as malign and illegitimate. This is the fundamental split that shapes the entire conversation. And you know, this quote from the famous sociologist Max Weber really helps us understand the logic behind that split. He basically defined the state as the one and only group that gets to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in a certain area. So by that logic, any other group that uses force is seen as challenging the state's very existence, and that's why their actions are automatically labeled illegitimate. Okay, so that sets the stage perfectly for our next section, because this is where things get really, really subjective. If the state is the one who decides which violence is legit, what happens when you don't agree with the state? Well, that leads us right into that classic thorny dilemma. Are we talking about a terrorist or a freedom fighter? I'm sure you've heard this phrase a million times, and for good reason. It gets right to the absolute heart of the matter. The label terrorist is fundamentally a question of your point of view. It all depends on your goals, what you believe, and which side of a fight you're on. The word itself is a political weapon just as much as it is a description of an action. And this isn't just some abstract idea. I mean, look at these real-world examples. This list has Nobel Peace Prize winners right alongside figures who are globally despised. Nelson Mandela's group, the ANC, was once officially designated a terrorist organization by the US. Yasser Arafat, Martin McGuinness. They were seen as terrorists for decades by their enemies before they eventually became part of peace processes. It just goes to show you how much the label can shift and how political it really is. And this image, this mural from Ireland, it just powerfully captures that clash of perspectives. To the British government and many, many others, the man in this painting was a terrorist, part of a group that killed civilians. But to the people who painted this mural, he was a soldier, a patriot, a freedom fighter resisting what they saw as a foreign occupation. Our job here isn't to take a side, but to just really understand how two completely opposite realities can exist for the very same person. Okay, so if the label itself is so subjective, what about the actual beliefs behind the violence? This is super important to get. Terrorism is not one single ideology. It's a tactic. It's a method used by all sorts of groups with completely different beliefs and goals. I mean, just look at the sheer range on this table. You've got revolutionary groups like the Bolsheviks who wanted to tear down an entire system. You have nationalist separatists like the PKK fighting for their own country. You have religious fundamentalists like ISIS, extremists on the far right and the far left, and even eco-terrorist groups. And the source material also includes these more controversial categories like state-sponsored terrorism and regime terrorism, with some scholars arguing that states actually cause far more death and destruction than non-state groups ever have. All right, so we've got all these different groups with different beliefs. How do they actually do what they do? We're going to shift gears now from the why to the how, looking at the methods they use and the often very strategic thinking that goes into choosing them. A really powerful example of this is what's called a symbolic attack. Here, we're looking at the giant Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, before and after the Taliban destroyed them back in 2001. Now, the point wasn't just to blow up some old statues. No, the goal was to erase history, to destroy a piece of culture they considered un-Islamic, and to send a shocking message to the entire planet. It was an attack on an idea, on an identity. And of course, symbolic attacks are just one tool in a very wide and often brutal toolkit. It can range from very specific, targeted assassinations and kidnappings, all the way to completely random bombings in crowded markets. We also see things like hijackings, like on 9/11, suicide bombings, and even copycat attacks, like the awful trend of using trucks to drive into crowds of people. But here's the thing, these choices are rarely random. There's often a cold, strategic calculation going on. Groups will weigh all these factors. How accurate is this weapon? How much damage can it do? How easy is it for us to get or build? And critically, what about traceability? Do they want the attacker to get away and fight again? Or is it a suicide mission where the whole point is to claim responsibility at the end? So this brings us to the most difficult and maybe the most important question of all. Why? We've looked at the what and the how, but now we have to try and understand the underlying causes, the conditions in a society, and the psychology of an individual that can lead someone down such a dark path. The source material is pretty clear that terrorism doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's often a symptom of much bigger problems. The potential root causes are complex, and they're all tangled together. Things like underdevelopment, massive economic inequality, or demographic pressures, what some call an enclave mentality, where one group feels totally isolated and surrounded. And of course, you have huge political grievances, where people feel completely suppressed with no peaceful options left. So that's the big picture, society-level stuff. But what about the individual? What makes a person actually sign up? Research often boils it down to three really powerful and very human needs. First, a burning sense of injustice, a feeling that your people have been deeply wronged and you want payback. Second, a search for identity. Extremist groups offer a very simple, black and white worldview that can feel really comforting if you're feeling lost. And third, the need for belonging. For someone feeling alienated, a terrorist group can feel like the loyal family they've always wanted. Okay, but wait a second. Feeling injustice, finding an identity, wanting to belong, that's one thing, but there's a massive, massive leap from joining a group to actually committing horrific acts of violence. So how does a person cross that moral line? Well, according to the groundbreaking work of psychologist Albert Bandura, a big part of the answer lies in this powerful process called moral disengagement. Basically, you can think of it as a set of psychological tricks or maneuvers that allow a person to switch off their conscience. It lets them do things that would normally go against everything they believe in, but without feeling that crushing guilt or self-hatred. And Bandura actually identified several specific ways this moral switch gets flipped. There's moral justification, which is telling yourself your violence serves some higher, noble cause. There's sanitizing language, using euphemisms like collateral damage instead of killing innocent people. But two of the most powerful are blaming the victims and dehumanizing them, convincing yourself that they somehow deserve what's happening to them or that they aren't even really human to begin with. And this historical propaganda image, it is a truly chilling and textbook example of that last mechanism, the dehumanization of victims. By portraying Jewish people not as fellow humans, but as monstrous spiders, as vermin, it makes violence against them seem not just psychologically possible, but righteous, necessary even. It is one of the most dangerous tools in the entire moral disengagement toolkit. So, wow, we've gone from the French Revolution all the way to modern psychology, from political labels to the tactics of violence. And it all leaves us with one final, incredibly difficult question, which our source material poses as a topic for debate. To fight terrorism, should governments require all citizens to be microchipped? It's a provocative thought, and it forces us right up against that core dilemma. What is the right balance between our security and our liberty? There are no easy answers here, and that's definitely something to think about.